Didn't necessarily want to appropriate the foreign-owned operations, but they wanted the oil companies to basically give a lot more of their profits to the government in a way that the companies were like, that doesn't work for us, we're leaving, and the oil was expropriated. And so they've the country and its oil company in the form it exists today doesn't have the expertise and the capital necessary to really maintain what is a very capital intensive and technologically complex industry. And so that's just the drop in Venezuelan oil production is incredible. It went from about 2.5 million barrels per day in the 90s down to less than 1 million barrels per day today. So it is in a very, very poor shape today. It requires tremendous investment, also tremendous expertise and know-how to really begin to turn that around.
President Trump has used the justification of essentially telling U.S. companies to come in and take back over the oil industry, that the assets were illegally seized by the Venezuelan government, and that the U.S. is just taking back what was its property prior to that. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but you have any thoughts about that argument?
I can't speak to the legal dimensions of it, but certainly it's the position of the major oil companies that the property was illegally expropriated, and there likely is interest in returning. Chevron did return and is currently operating through a joint venture with the national oil company that was really came about quite recently. I think it was in the context of the Russian-Ukraine war, oil prices climbing, that the U.S. decided to kind of facilitate that. Chevron, I imagine, would, under the right circumstances, would be interested in expanding. Perhaps the other oil companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips would be interested in returning. But I think to do so, one, there's the ownership question, but they really need to operate in a stable legal environment, a stable economic environment, and they have opportunities to invest money around the world. They would want it to be profitable, which I think a piece that I was very curious about reading some of the president's comments is he talked about some of this money from extracting oil would come back to the United States, which sounds appealing, but that implies an additional tax essentially on any U.S. oil company that operates there, providing not only a lot of money back to Venezuela, which Venezuela would expect, it's in poor fiscal shape, but also some type of income going back to the U.S. That would really make the economics difficult, given you already start with this very heavy crude oil that's not very attractive in the first place.
Well, and would you first have to remove all the barriers to exporting the oil, because essentially the embargo that's going on now, until that's lifted, would anybody invest money in Venezuelan oil?
Yeah, presumably, and a lot of the embargo is from the U.S., so potentially President Trump's and his administration could lift that embargo in the context of this sort of shift and a return of the U.S. oil companies. That would need to happen to make that work for the companies.
What about the instability in Venezuela's government? You have the successor, at least as of today, to President Maduro, is a loyalist of his, someone who, at least on the surface, wouldn't appear to be friendly to U.S. interests or welcoming of U.S. oil companies beyond Chevron operating now coming back in. So again, with the current governmental situation in Venezuela, would a company want to get involved?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. With the Maduro regime is essentially still in place. This is a regime that really doesn't believe in capitalism and a market economy. It would be expect to extract a lot of profits and money from these companies. So the current government in place, it's hard to imagine that happening. I think the more general question of, even if there is some type of transition to something and there's sort of instability associated with that, that's not going to be very attractive. That said, international oil companies, they operate in unstable countries around the world. They do quite a bit of that, and it doesn't always work out well for them, but they do have experience investing billions of dollars in places where there's big questions about the future of those governments, and there could be corruption in those countries, and there could be civil wars, all kinds of things. And these companies, if they can earn enough money, will still operate in those countries.
And just before I let you go, sort of the future of the global oil market, my understanding is developing countries have really been at the forefront of increasing demand for oil worldwide. But overall, as you see renewables and a variety of different technologies coming in, what is the future global market for oil? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think that's an area of quite interesting right now. The international projections that are coming out still show a continued growth in global oil demand through 2050, which those of us who really hope that the world addresses climate change, that's not something we want to see. So that it does look like the projections currently are that the embrace of things like electric transportation are still pretty slow relative to the demands for oil that are coming through the growth and continued growth in places like Asia. So the demand side looks strong, but also the supply side. There's a lot of new oil coming online. The U.S. is a powerhouse in oil production at this point. There's big new oil production occurring off of the coast of Guyana, not far from Venezuela. And so the supply still seems to be there. Demand still seems to be strong. But then again, the oil market does feel like the market is appropriately supplied right now.